What's up, everybody? This might sound weird to the new people for a minute, but I'll explain history as I see it, and hopefully it'll make sense to you in a little while. But I've had a sneaking suspicion for quite a while that Plato, especially the Republic, is a product of the humanists during the Renaissance era that they dated back to ancient Greece. At this time, the Church of Rome, soon to be the Holy Roman Empire, had all but absolute power in the areas that they ruled at the time. I'll go into more detail later about that. But for one, the Zohar was written at this time, and the guy claimed that it was a 1,000-year-old lost manuscript. And I just did a video on how Josephus pretty much just traces back to around the 1300s. But it wasn't uncommon for someone to write something at this time and then say it was an ancient manuscript. If you say I just wrote this, then people will be like, okay, that's cool. But if you say this is a 1,000-year-old lost manuscript from the greatest thinker of ancient Greece, well, then it's got years of authenticity dust on it and nobody questions it. But it kind of hurts my brain to think about this actually being written in the Renaissance because so much ancient literature seems to be influenced by this. So hopefully this video will get kind of deep. And if you're brand new to this, hopefully I can make it make sense. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to the algorithm for not shadow banning my videos lately. Somebody laughed in the comments section and said, oh great, he's talking to the algo. This is how religions start. You know that I don't use colorful nicknames for sensitive words for no reason, right? Yeah, the algo's listening to every word I say. You see these yellow marks down here saying ad suitability? That's because if it's a controversial topic, I'm not allowed to talk about it. Every other channel on YouTube can be talking about it, like the files, but if I do, it gets restricted. So yeah, they're listening. The first video that I asked nicely for the algorithm to share it with new people, right here, I got 54,000 views, which is double anything I've got in 18 months. And it got me 1.4 thousand subs. So if it works, I'll try it again. Anyway, welcome new peeps, and thank you to all you that have been watching for years, and thank you to the algorithm. So I was working on this shower, right? Isn't that how all good stories start? And I had listened to about 3 hours of lectures by Michael Sugrue on Plato's Republic. And I gotta say, if you guys are into philosophy and stuff, you've got to check this guy out. It's not often that I look up someone's accolades, which doesn't hold a lot of weight with me, but I was just checking to see if he got the prestige that he deserves in this world. And he did. He taught at Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and then Princeton. And I don't know that I've said this about anyone that I've ever watched on YouTube, but he's truly a brilliant man. This guy will pace back and forth on stage with no notes and will deliver an hour lecture on subjects that, when you're reading them, sometimes you'll spend a couple hours on one paragraph. Go read some Immanuel Kant or some Descartes. That's why I only know just a little bit about it, because it's so hard to wrap your head around at times. But he flows through this stuff like water, and you can listen to a lecture and then start it over and you'll learn new stuff again. He'll make this big profound point and then just move on to the next thing, and you're still contemplating that first one for 15 seconds, and then you're halfway lost by the time you get on to the next subject. So if you're into that kind of thing, definitely check him out. I'm not going to try to do an in-depth breakdown of Plato's Republic. I'm a working man, but here's a couple things I walked away with after listening to this. So I've had a sneaking suspicion for a while that Plato might have been a product of the Renaissance and not actually ancient Greek. And that's because, like, the Republic is just too perfect for the humanist movement. But before we get into that, let me get the new people caught up to speed on the way I view the world here. I'll just do a quick synopsis of it, but I've got this entire playlist for any new people that this is kind of the basis of my worldview at the moment. The Earth has its disaster cycles, and then we keep going through the same cycle of progression. Now, I know that some popularized theories on here share some of the same information because they got a few things right, but with every groupthink endeavor, people just say things and then everybody acts like it's true. And it doesn't take very long before everything is so wrong about that theory that you're better off just starting over from nothing. One thing the internet definitely got right was the Earth disaster cycle, which I actually helped to propagate. We didn't know this stuff back when I started. We just realized that these cities look like they've been through a major cataclysm, and the powers that be have done a good job of marginalizing this information. But I've got numerous videos going in detail about what happened here. The funny thing is, though, is there was a major cycle in 536 and then another in the 1300s with the Dark Ages right in the middle where nothing happened. No literature, no technological innovation. And when you get down to it on the architecture, you could easily see that it could be slid 100 or 300 years one way or another. So I'm not 100% sure either way, but I can definitely see how these might have been the same events. Just, well, really what they did was they took all the stories of this from the East and said that was in 536 AD, and then all of the stories from the 1300s and said that that was in the West. But the important thing to know here is that in the 1300s, a major event happened, and it might have taken as many as 2/3 of the population and we're talking worldwide. I literally found an old Native American account of a meteor falling up in the Great Lakes area like 150 years before Columbus, which lined up exactly with the 1348 period, which is when the Black D happened. After that time period, you had two big things. You had the Renaissance and the Inquisition. At this time, the Church of Rome, the Catholics, were the most powerful organization on earth, hands down. They say that they achieved papal supremacy, which is outright authoritarian control, during those mysterious Dark Ages from 5th century onward. But I think it's just as likely that after everybody perished in the 1300s, and after a few incidents like the Albigensian Crusade, where the Holy Fathers eliminated everyone in southern France because they believed differently, that the Church of Rome then decided what was and what was not history. And they enforced what they said was not history with the Inquisition. I think the 1300s events is part of what made the church so powerful, because the world was coming apart at the seams and people would have thought that the gods or God was angry. Some groups got into fanatical penance, like the Flagellants, and they would go from town to town whipping and hitting themselves with boards and just self-mortification as a penance for their sins. So I think the church had more sway and influence over people's minds at that time than anything we've got today. And I'll try to qualify that statement. I may have to do a whole video explaining this in detail, but briefly, this is the balance of power that we have today in chronological order. So starting over here with the 1300s, you had the crown and the gown. Power was split up between the church and royalty. Then came the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, Jan Hus breaking away from the church's grip. And this is the most undernamed event in history. This was one of the most lethal confrontations of our modern era. Then came the Enlightenment period and the Brotherhoods, the Age of Exploration, where they went out and colonized the world, and huge fortunes were made, like the Dutch East India Company. Then around that time, the whole idea of sovereign nations came into existence. That's a product of the Enlightenment period. Then the Industrial Revolution made more fortunes. And with that comes power. Just think Zuckerberg and Musk. Well, at this time, they were railroad, steel, and oil. And with those fortunes comes a slice of the pie of power. Then came the one ring to rule them all: international finance and fiat currencies. You got to keep in mind, Red Shield didn't come on the scene until the early 1800s, late 1700s. I have several videos explaining how the tribal moneylenders, let's say, have attempted the financial conquest of countries for 1,000 years, literally, but they never succeeded, and the locals rebelled against them and kicked them out or something. Then around the 1800s, Red Shield came on the scene, and they managed to get the entire world under their thumb through financial means. So they get a lot of credit for being the hidden hand that calls all the shots. But all of these other institutions still have their powers, with sovereign nations pretty well being at the top of that list. And this is why I say that the Church of Rome had more power back in their day than anything going today. This might sound dumb, but it's accurate. No one today can tell everyone to wear green hats, and everyone does it. The sovereign nations and the people of would say, no, we don't want to wear green hats. Now, the financiers could tell the sovereign nations, do this or else, and then the public leaders will try to find a way to persuade everyone to wear a green hat, but they're never going to use the full force of the military to insist everyone wears green hats. So, as with the state of the world at this particular moment that could change at any time, nobody actually has that outright authoritarian control like that. Just like with the pokey a couple of years ago, they can threaten you and they can reward you if you do it, but nobody's going to be kicking your door in saying, why aren't you wearing a green hat? But with the Church of Rome back in the day, they did have enough power to where they could say, God wills it, everyone must wear a green hat. And if you didn't, you were excommunicated, which meant an eternity in hell, and they'd help speed you along that route in a very public and painful manner. So everybody sees that and says, I'm wearing a green hat. Nobody has that kind of power today. So when I say there's no Mr. Burns directing every minute detail of the world, this is what I'm talking about. There are a lot of Mr. Burns level people, and they are all pushing and pulling, affecting the world in their own way, some being more powerful than others. So that's how we got from the 1300s to today. Now let's go back to right after the 1300s event. So if they did invent the Dark Ages, then these are some of the ways that they cover that up. They say that while the West was in the Dark Ages, this was the Islamic Golden Age in the East. And I'm pretty sure they say that all Greek texts had disappeared from the Western world, at least a lot of them. And what they say is there's a renaissance of the 12th century just before all the cataclysms where European scholars flocked to centers of Islamic learning, and they had preserved all of these ancient Greek texts. Islamic scholars had preserved and built upon the knowledge of the ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, which had been lost or forgotten in most of Western Europe. So technically, in the Western world, there's nobody that can authenticate that these actually date back to the ancient Greek days. And then all of this was translated through Arabic. So theoretically, somebody could have wrote a manuscript at this time and say that it had come from one of the great Greek thinkers, right? Well, yes, it is possible. Case in point being the donation of Constantine, which was allegedly a 4th century document where Emperor Constantine decreed that all his power should be ceded to the Church of Rome. So all the wealth and power of the Roman Empire, and oh, here you go. But around the 16th century, this was found out to be a forgery. So the Church of Rome had completely made up a claim and forged documents saying that they were now the rightful heirs to the Roman Empire. Once again, this leading to papal supremacy. So from the 1300s events for a couple hundred years going into the future, everybody thought that this was real. Okay, now keep rolling with me. During the Renaissance, these Arab documents were first introduced to the Western world, and they say that Plato lived 300 BC. And really, when you think about how little info we have of the ancient world, the 3 big philosophers are Socrates, his student Plato, his student Aristotle. That's kind of like only 3 of the 50 famous philosophers here of the Enlightenment period being remembered in the future. But Plato, 300 BC, Plotinus, with a very similar name, carried on the works of Plato in the 3rd century, and he founded Neoplatonism. Then in the 1300s, right after 2/3 of the population was no more, and there were just whole sections of city that were no-go zones and crumbling and falling, there just wasn't anybody left to maintain those areas. So this is right after society had crumbled, and you have Gemestos Plethon. Plato, Plotinus, Plethon. And now get this. Gemestos Plethon was a Greek scholar and one of the most renowned philosophers of the 1400s. He was a chief pioneer of the revival of Greek scholarship in Western Europe. And I just showed you what that means. Allegedly, he's reviving old Greek texts from the Arabic. So in 1438, he reintroduced Plato's ideas to Western Europe during the Council of Florence. The Council of Florence is the world superpower at the time, the Catholics. And look, they didn't want people learning about anything but the Bible, no competition, which we'll actually talk about if we ever get to Plato's philosophy here. But the Holy Roman Empire is the law of the land at this time. And Plethon is telling Church of Rome that he had translated these ancient Greek texts of Plato's. Meanwhile, Plethon himself also formulated his political vision in several speeches throughout his life. So he's basically being political with the church authorities here. So from 1415 to 1418, he's handing out pamphlets back out on the street. That's how the propaganda was done back in the day. And he was arguing for a more constitutional monarchy type order, which we'll cover if we get to Plato. It just so happens the social and political ideas in these pamphlets were largely derived from Plato's Republic. So the ancient texts that he had translated just happened to line up with his ideal worldview. And it could be, like they say, it could be that Plato actually wrote this and Gemistos was influenced by that. But it could also be that Plethon just said that this ancient guy Plato had written it. So then you got to question, was Plato a real guy or did Plethon invent him? Now, he could have been a real guy and then Plethon writes the Republic and just says that Plato wrote it. Or the whole thing can be a donation of Constantine. But then the story gets deeper here. Meet Cosimo de' Medici, who was an Italian banker and politician who became the de facto first ruler of Florence during the Italian Renaissance. Florence was the center of the world at the time. And de' Medici was basically these guys rolled into one. He invented international banking in our current era. He had money to throw around. He was interested in the arts and humanities, history. He was a humanist. And he met Gemistos Plethon, and they founded the Platonic Academy. So the billionaire of the time is now funding a college, basically. And it's just like the big moneyed interests of today and the agendas that they're promoting. They're trying to persuade the public over to their way of thinking without upsetting the powers that be too much. Don't forget, there were multiple inquisitions throughout this time, and radical ideas might get you a visit from the inquisitor. So in order to not be publicly martyred for your ideas, what if you said that you had translated these ideas from an ancient Greek text? I ain't saying that's what happened, but it could have been what happened. I know all through this period that people tried to keep alive the old Hellenistic spirit. This is Voltaire's funeral from the late 1700s, and they're even carrying Roman standards. Anyway, I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, Plethon or Plato, but now let's talk about the text, Plato's Republic itself. And I'm going to do my best to freeball through this. Everything about this story is too perfect allegorically. It's told as a true story about Socrates and all these guys. And it ends up being a story about them making up a story. They all have a dialogue about inventing the perfect city, the perfect republic. Each one of them have their different ideas about the ideal city, so they just debate about it. And here's one of the really interesting things that I pulled out of it is the myth of the metals. The God who fashioned you mixed gold in the composition of those among you who are fit to rule so that they are of the precious quality. And he put silver in the auxiliaries and iron and brass in the farmers and craftsmen. So the first estate, kings and rulers, were made with gold. Then the noble class is made of silver, and all the middle class is made with iron and brass. Now, I find that really interesting if you think in terms of the Sumerians, the Enuma Elish, where the gods created mankind basically as a slave race. But in terms of electronics, gold is the best conductor, silver is next, then iron and brass is still conductive, but not like the other ones. And, well, what makes our bodies work is basically some electrical charges stimulating muscles, and we move. Make what you will of that. Now, here's why I say this story is just too perfect to be actually true. In Socrates' ideal city, he has the philosopher king. And then you have the silver class, the nobles and warriors. Then you got the craftsmen and farmers in the bronze class. Now, they discuss what should be taught to the warrior class. And they say, take a dog, for instance. A dog will love and protect its master, even if he is a bad man, when he might go after a virtuous man. He's just interested in protecting the way of life and the people that he knows. And the same should go for a warrior. So you teach them how great your culture is and how others can be a threat to that. Like the lesser orders out there, the oligarchies, and he ranks democracy below an oligarchy. Then below that is the tyrant. Now, what I found really interesting about this dialogue is it's just as important what you don't teach as what you do teach. You want to instill the right virtues in them and not encourage the bad ones. So then they talk about Homer and Odysseus, the Trojan War. And Socrates says, this isn't wise to teach to our children. They live and die by the sword, where our warriors should be more thinking and principle-based. There's actually a lot of bad influences with the Homeric heroes. First, Paris steals Agamemnon's wife. Then Agamemnon declares war on all of Troy. It's been a long time, so I hope I'm getting this right. Then Achilles puts Hector to the sword and desecrates his body, won't give him back to his father to be buried. And this is an offense to the gods themselves. But Socrates basically says these heroes of old, to give them the benefit of the doubt, they did what they had to do. But we're talking about a more cultured, idealized society. And the Homeric heroes aren't the best role models to our youth. So even though I am a big proponent of free speech, I gotta admit that there are some things that be better off if some people didn't know. Like all these people thinking that the world's gonna end by 2030, that's just 5 years away because of climate change. And I just did a video of how they indoctrinate our students in universities ever since the 60s. So I can agree we'd be better off if they had never got that seed planted in their head. But then comes the question, well then, who decides what should and shouldn't be taught? And I'm sidetracking from Plato here. They don't actually go into that part. But this would be my answer to that. Intellectually speaking, you have the gold, silver, and bronze classes. So you don't censor and destroy the information. I mean, you should keep this knowledge around for posterity's sake in case it pops its head back up in the future, like comradism always does. But you don't teach that to the bronze class. And I'm not talking class as in genetics and the way you're born. I'm talking like at an academic level where everybody can get the knowledge if they're smart enough to handle it. And just for the record, what we have going on today, I don't think people should talk about in freedom of speech terms. They should talk about it in freedom of press terms. We should be talking about what allows somebody the authority to operate mass media and influence millions of people in this country. So anyway, they've created their perfect society. Now what? Well, you want to make sure that nothing changes. You've already created the ultimate society, so you're not big on progressivism after that. But this is why I say it's just too perfect of a story. It's a story within a story where all of the characters in this story are the archetypes of the people that they describe in their story. So Socrates is the wise philosopher king. Thrasymachus represents the oligarchs. Glaucon, the noble warrior, and on. One of the guys represents democracy, but they're definitely the archetypes of the different orders. An eloquent way I've heard this expressed is where Michelangelo tried to carve the perfection of man in the statue of David, Plato created the perfect man in words. Then we get into the allegory of the cave and how this is an imperfect existence. And I've already got brain fry, so I think I'll pass on all that. But yeah, apparently all of this knowledge comes to us from ancient Greek writings that were translated into Arabic that were then translated back into Greek and Latin. And the guy that just happened to find these long lost texts of Plato had the name of Plethon, who had a big money backer who wanted to teach ideas that were frowned upon by the powers that be at the time, Holy Roman Empire. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.